Good morning, everyone. Hello and welcome to the last day, our fifth day of the 5th annual Interior Health Research Week. My name is Kim Peek, and I work with both our hosts for this week, being the IH Research Department and the BC Support Unit Interior Center. I am deeply grateful to be living, loving, and learning on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of the beautiful Syilx Okanagan Nation. Let us take the first few moments to acknowledge all the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories where we have the honor to be today. And I invite everyone to please share the names of these lands in the chat box. If you do not know the name, please take a moment to explore the link, native-land.ca, and please share after you've learned. A few housekeeping items. Please note that the chat will be disabled in about 5 minutes, and then throughout the presentation. But at the end of the presentation is a question and answer period where attendees can ask questions and communicate with the presenter through the chat box. Every presentation throughout this week will be recorded, and links to these recordings will be sent to you directly when they're posted online. I'm honored to introduce my co-host, Interior Health Regional Practice Lead for the IH Research Department and BC Support Unit Interior Center, Leslie Bryant, who will be formally introducing the upcoming presentation. Take it away, Leslie.
Good morning, everybody. I'm calling in today from the very sunny territory of the Syilx Nation people here in Lake Country, BC. It's a real pleasure, actually, to introduce our speaker this morning, almost Dr. Jemima Demi-Ejegi. Sorry, I just watched that. I met Jemima about 9 months ago, and she had this fabulous idea to look at the perspectives of the experiences of Black people and compare it with some of the experiences of Indigenous people here in the interior region. And this is through a partnership that we have with Maastricht University from the Netherlands for these master's students in global health. So it is my great honor to introduce to you Jemima, who is going to present her master's project called New Voices, Perspectives from Black Healthcare Workers and Service Recipients. Take it away, Jemima. Thank you.
Thank you, Leslie. Good morning, everyone. I hope you're all doing well this morning. So as Leslie said, my name is Jemima, and I'm a 4th year medical student, so almost there. And I'm really excited to be able to speak to you today and just really grateful for this opportunity. I'm going to share my screen so you can see my slides. And hopefully you can all see that. Just let me know. Great, thank you so much. Yeah, so my name is Jemima, and I'm a 4th year medical student. I'm currently in the UK, but last year I took a year out of medical school because I wanted to study an MSc in global health, because I'm really interested in social determinants and health equality, health equity, and just really looking at the different social factors and the history of our healthcare and how that impacts people today. So yeah, I took a year out to go to the Netherlands and study global health. And that's where I came across Interior Health, as we have a partnership with them in Maastricht University. And Interior Health was just really kind, and they offered me the opportunity to be able to study something that I'm really passionate about and actually conduct a research study. And the theme was really broad. It was prejudice and discrimination. And, you know, so many things can come from that. And this particular topic is something that I'm really passionate about, both personally and what I've seen in the workplace, in the healthcare sector. So today I'm going to be talking about perspectives from Black healthcare workers and service recipients. And the title of this study is called New Voices. Hopefully it's going to provide some new perspectives, which maybe you may have heard, may not have heard. And yeah, hopefully I just think we can explore this together and just have a really interesting 45 minutes. So yeah, let's go. Yeah, so first of all, I think it is really important to do an acknowledgement. And first of all, I just want to really just acknowledge the participants and everyone who was able to actually contribute and had the bravery to do so. And even though I did the internship virtually, it's still really important to consider the different territories that I was acting under as an interior health intern. And yeah, I just feel incredibly blessed to be able to share that space with people. So thank you so much. So this is just an overview of what I'm going to be discussing today. I'm going to provide you with an introduction to the study, a bit about the theoretical background and the context, moving on to the methods for the study, and then the results in the discussion are kind of like the most interesting bits. So the introduction for this New Voices study. In 2020, racism was described as the other pandemic, and I found that to be really interesting and really striking. We all know the COVID pandemic has had so many impacts on each of us, each and every single one of us. And it's interesting to think of how racism can be like almost like a parallel to the coronavirus, as something which people have been talking about, something which has been in society and in the system for a long time, but has just kind of come to the forefront now, with many different factors contributing to that. And I'm sure many of you will be familiar with Dr. Tapolafon's report, the In Plain Sight report. And it's an amazing report that looks into Indigenous specific racism and discrimination in BC healthcare. And something that I just found to be really striking, really bold and brave, with what participants were able to share to do with their experiences and just being honest about what they see in their healthcare system and what they want to change as well. And the Canadian Institute for Health Information also released the Grandmother Perspective report. And this focused on the need for more race-based data. And something that I found in my literature research was a lack of Black specific data in this area. And you can see the image on the bottom. Interior health leaders are actually talking about this. They spoke about this in 2020, December 2020, which I'm going to talk about on the next slide. Yes, so in light of this In Plain Sight report, interior health leaders have actually wanted to address the racism that they see in the healthcare system. And I think it's interesting to look at interior health as a system and the evidence that has been found from this report, and the fact that Black voices are quite silent since the report aimed to be Indigenous specific, and rightly so. It's interesting to consider how Black voices have been silent for a number of years in Canada, but also in the interior region. So I really wanted to use this study as a way to give people a voice and actually to be able to contribute and speak about what they've experienced, what they've seen. So that's the purpose of the study. So moving on to the theory and the context behind this study. What does literature say? What does research say? So the first thing to really think about is the construct of race. So it's interesting how race has both a biological and a social overlap. So if we think about melanin, that is what gives our skin its lovely pigment. Some people have lighter skin, some people have darker skin, but you can think of melanin as like the biological side. But then this also has social implications. So you can see how over time, things like class and somebody's work status, or we have histories such as slavery and oppression, which means that skin color is automatically given this social significance or insignificance, which is really interesting. And looking at race as a social construct, this means that it has a really big impact for our identity and how we see ourselves. One of the things that I wanted to get into with this study was how different Black people actually define race. Are there differences? Are there similarities? And how do stereotypes and exclusion actually impact people when it comes to this? The next thing I wanted to think about is race-related healthcare experiences. And there's something called the hidden curriculum that I came across in my research. And that is where white skin is used as the predominant focal point, or the area for comparison or literature, or even when thinking about medical signs or symptoms, there's a predominance when it comes to white skin as being like the norm. So this is interesting to think about how this impacts people's health experiences. And also when thinking about racism, it's important to think about different types and almost the spectrum that exists. So we have the overt experiences where someone might say something to your face or say something overtly racist. But then there's also the more nuanced and complex racism, which we can't exactly put our finger on, but we know it's there. And there have been multiple accounts of this throughout literature. So I wanted to really explore, how does the colonial narrative impact health experiences? So going all the way back into history and thinking about how that impacts the here and now. And also using a really critical approach. So not just thinking about overt racism that can easily be quantified, but also the experiences that people can't quite put their finger on. I found that really interesting to think about. And then how this all links to cultural safety and humility. So we know that cultural safety throughout literature and practice, training, education, is predominantly regarded as an Indigenous specific concept, which I'll go into a bit more later. And Dr. Tabu-Lafon's report had little reference to cultural humility, so I also wanted to explore this. So thinking about the Canadian context for Black individuals in healthcare, in my literature review, I found kind of 4 main areas. So the first I want to talk about is Black and Indigenous. So for Black and Indigenous individuals, I found that there are completely different circumstances, and both groups of individuals have their unique considerations and their history that really can't just be compared on a parallel scale. But there are some overlapping themes such as control and racialization, where people have a race kind of put onto them, a label put onto them that hasn't been concurred within the group, but has come from an outside factor. And also the colonial narrative, so how that also links to healthcare. So thinking about how slavery, oppression, injustice has kind of bled its way into our modern healthcare system, which I'll discuss more in a minute. When thinking about Black histories in Canada, it's interesting how Black Canadians or Black individuals in Canada are often compared to Black individuals in the US, such as Black Americans or African Americans. And there's often this comparison between the two groups, but not many people will talk about Black individuals in Canada as a standalone group. And this is really interesting because Black individuals in Canada have a variety in their history and their lived experiences, with some coming as free people way back when you had slavery, some coming as slaves. But you also have, through globalization, a lot of immigration and a lot of people moving between high income countries and not just from low income to high income. So going back to think about how slavery and oppression and segregation have impacted modern day experiences, we can see in Canada, unfortunately, a lot of anti-Black racism in the healthcare sector, in housing and education, as well as the criminal justice system. And when thinking about healthcare inequalities, we see that Black people are often ignored or stereotyped or accused of various things such as over-reporting their pain or drug seeking. And literature reveals a lack of social mobility for Black individuals who want to achieve healthcare positions or work in healthcare, particularly in fields such as medicine. And we also see, unfortunately, a mistrust of healthcare amongst Black individuals, and this is seen through phenomena such as vaccine hesitancy. So thinking about all of this, putting it into the methods for the study, so what are we actually going to do for the study? The study has a main research question, which asks, how do Black healthcare workers and healthcare recipients of interior health perceive and appraise their healthcare experiences? So perception is mainly focusing on what they think, how they view things, and then appraise, thinking about how this can be critically analyzed and interpreting what this means. And this main research question can be explored through 4 main sub-questions. The first is focusing just on the broad theme of race, about how people reflect on and understand this construct of race. The second question looks at how people feel race impacts their healthcare experiences. The third question looks at how the experiences of Black individuals differ from those of the Indigenous individuals in Dr. Tabu-Lafon's report. And it's really important to know that these are thinking of participants in the studies, so in the New Voices study and in Dr. Tabu-Lafon's study. And while we can think about how this can be applied to the broader populations, it's important to know that not everybody's views would be represented in either of these studies. And then lastly, also thinking about the practical implications for cultural safety and cultural humility. So the methodology can be broken up into the design and the sampling. So going to use critical data, qualitative data with a critical form of analysis. So looking mainly at quotes and things participants have said and critically analyzing this to look at what has influenced this language and reading between the lines, you could say. Looking at the actual population who was involved, this study involved Black healthcare workers and service recipients in the interior British Columbia region. Thinking about data collection, we had an interesting form of interview because, of course, coronavirus meant that interviews couldn't be conducted face-to-face. But I was very grateful to be able to chat with participants over Zoom and to have some amazing discussions. Also data analysis. So as I mentioned, the critical discourse analysis, and this was carried out on in vivo, which enabled me to produce various themes, linking what participants had said, and this produced some amazing results. And of course, ethical approval had to be obtained from Interior Health and Maastricht University as well. Yeah, so this bit is quite interesting because the study had to tread a fine line between anonymity and authenticity. So you want to be able to really understand where participants are coming from and reading their stories as what has happened to actual people. But at the same time, you have to consider that the population of Black individuals in the interior region is quite small. So you don't want anyone to be identifiable. So that is why pseudonyms were given to people and with a brief participant description to really enable you to get an idea for who participants are and provide a good narrative for the study. So the results of the study, which I think are the most interesting. So the results of this study can be split into three main categories. The first category is race, which is quite broad, but it's looking at appearance and color. So participants described a lot about appearance and color, as well as Western social construct, identity, and context and user dependency of race, which is really interesting. Second idea was looking at race-related healthcare experiences. So participants discussed both positive and negative experiences when it comes to race and healthcare. And they discussed these in terms of patients and colleagues and healthcare workers. Cultural safety and humility. Participants described the importance of curiosity in asking questions, as well as listening and feeling heard, as well as a broad variety of other themes such as leadership, power, training, education, and development. So a lot of information on this slide, but we'll break it down further as we go. So thinking about the first category of results, which was race and what participants described, this was really interesting. So when thinking about race, participants thought that appearance and color was interesting, not necessarily just in terms of the actual color of people's skin, but how they appeared to other people and how they were perceived. So I'm going to read some of the information as participants explained it to me. So one of the participants, Bolu, he explained that there's always a little level of pressure that any sort of statement he makes will be attributed or linked to his race. And he explains that some of his friends have asked him to put his picture in his email ID, but he hasn't done it because he doesn't want someone to read a report and have race as the lens to view that report. And just thinking about his language there, it's really interesting that he says that race can be a lens to view something. And that really comes to do with social appearance and the fact that race is a social construct, especially a Western social construct with Eurocentric influence. So it's interesting that he uses this language that links to appearance and color and how someone's perceived. With regards to this construct, one of the participants named Izzy also describes a social construct when it comes to race. And she uses a variety of examples. She explains that you have the American context, which I explained earlier about how the US is frequently compared to Canada when it comes to Black individuals. And also that you have the Western context, so more of a Eurocentric ideas when it comes to race, which are influenced by colonialism, and also apartheid, So we see that this is not just a concept that is in Canada or in the US, or even just within Europe, but we see that this spans a multitude of countries and backgrounds as well. Another participant, Harrison, explains that race as a construct is something that is societal and systemic and reinforced. And through the use of these words, he really conveys that it's something that is intentional and something that is perpetuated in society. And that goes to show the influence that this colonial narrative has to this day. When looking at identity, Aaliyah came up with some really interesting examples, and she used the example of somebody filling out a form. So she says that a white South African person is African by birth and identity, but when they're filling in a form, the only option they have is Black African. And they're not Black, but they're African. So she explains how this understanding of race is often based on the options that someone's given and not how they feel about those options. So you may have a category that's asking you to tick your ethnicity or your race, but thinking about where those categories came from and who actually created and designed those categories, we see that they have a lot of colonial influence. And unfortunately, some participants had really negative connotations with the word race, such as this participant, Danielle. And she explains that for her, race has never been associated with anything kind, that it's always something unkind. So when she hears the word race, she's looking for what's coming next. And this is interesting because it links to this idea of context and user dependency. So the word as itself, race, is just a word. But for her, it's important the context and who's using that word, who is leading the conversation, and who has the voice in those conversations. So again, we see themes of control and even oppression coming through. So moving on to the second set of results, which link race to healthcare experiences. One of the participants, Elijah, works as a doctor, and he had a really interesting example to share. So he spoke about negative experiences with his patients. So he said that on one side, he's experienced patients who are skeptical and questioning his knowledge, his skills, his qualifications, because of the fact that he trained in Africa and is African, but is now working and living in Canada, and wondering if he's even qualified for this. So you can see that this is quite a covert form of racism, which doesn't explicitly say anything, but is kind of hinting towards not really believing his qualifications or his skills due to his race. And then he also mentioned some really overt forms of racism, with patients even referring to him with the N-word, which is quite sad to hear. But he also explained that this is a spectrum, and this I found to be really interesting because he said that it needed to be interpreted in context. So he used the example of a patient who has used this language but is quite mentally disturbed. So he mentioned that typically when patients are feeling better and they're not mentally disturbed, that their language would change, they'd be more cordial, more respectful. And one of his patients actually came and apologized after using the N-word when they were feeling better. So I think that this was a really mature approach, as he didn't just take the incident as a one-off racist event, but looked at it within the context of what was happening with that patient at that time. So I found this to be really interesting. He also went on to describe his encounters with his colleagues, specifically negative encounters. And these were predominantly focused on political conversations or conversations about controversial events or opinions. And he found these to be really disappointing. His first example he used was about people sitting in the doctor's lounge and discussing the fact that Donald Trump's quite a better president than the one they had in the US again. So we can see this US narrative coming through. He found this to be really painful and triggering based on the history in his words. And also with the example of people referring to the insurrection as people having a bit of fun and being a bit rowdy. And this actually caused him to leave the lunchroom because he was so uncomfortable. And finally, perhaps the saddest and most shocking was a conversation about the residential schools. and people discussing the concept of it being a cemetery as opposed to the absolutely shocking ordeal that it is. And he found these types of comments to be even harder than what he hears from patients. And I think that this is really interesting, despite being incredibly sad. It's interesting to think about how these casual encounters with colleagues can be much more painful than overt racism that comes from patients, because one would expect better from their colleagues with regards to the training and everything that they've had. So it's an interesting point to think about this. Moving on to think about some microaggressions, various participants spoke about how microaggressions can actually be really damaging, particularly when it comes to relations with one's colleagues. So one participant, Aaliyah, discussed about being asked to show her ID by her colleagues. And she says, if you ask me for my ID, you're saying that I don't belong here. And I think that is really powerful because it speaks to the theme of belonging and what makes somebody fit into a certain environment or not fit in. And when it comes to race or appearance, that is something which is really easy to categorize people visually. And also, Harrison also described an event with his colleague where he was accused of being aggressive and threatening. And he explains that the angry Black man trope was being applied. So here we see again another example of a microaggression based on race that is coming through. And one of the other participants, Izzy, discussed her experience with a healthcare worker, namely her family physician. And she kind of compares her experience to other white patients that she knows who've been treated by the same family physician. She explains that their concerns and their issues were taken a bit more seriously than hers. And she was asked they were asked much fewer questions than she was. And I found this interesting because she almost describes the idea of an interrogation or somebody asking questions due to suspicion or not really taking her seriously. And she says that she didn't get the same treatment. So she uses a lot of comparative language, which is interesting to consider because we know that the world that we live in, it's so much easier now with social media and with globalization to see what's happening, not just in other parts of the world, but also with people down the street and people that we know. And this is really interesting to think about. Elijah also comments on positive experiences with his patients. And positive experiences are something that I really wanted to highlight in this study because we do, of course, see a lot of negativity. But I think it's really important to consider positive encounters as well. So he considers the connection that comes from patients that are from African or Afro-Caribbean descent that come to see him. And he describes the doctor-client connection that happens when he speaks with many of these patients. And he explains in one particular encounter that patients would ask questions about where he came from and wanting to know about him and make that connection based on race. And he explains that he uses the opportunity to affirm them. And I thought that this was a really, really useful example because it's good to celebrate diversity and it's good to celebrate where we come from and being able to connect based on that. But he actually went further and was able to use race to enhance patient care and enhance patient outcomes. It's just something that this study really supports strongly. And thinking more about positive experiences, this time with colleagues, we know that Kelowna is a small city. So this is really powerful when you're able to have a community and feel represented, as Harrison explains, and it's a positive experience. And Elijah also goes on to explain the sense of connection with colleagues and to have those conversations. So again, we see that it's quite a complex and nuanced thing to be able to talk about your lived experience, but a really gratifying thing to be able to do. And Izzy also discusses a positive experience with one of her healthcare workers after she'd had a traumatic experience and required counseling. And the counselor was actually also from Afro-Caribbean descent and was also an immigrant. And she explains that having this commonality of someone also being an immigrant from a similar background, similar cultural context, meant that she could really understand where she was coming from. And similar to what Elijah described, Izzy also describes how her healthcare worker brings insight into her challenges. So uses race and her understanding of culture and shared background to actually improve patient care and improve patient outcomes. So finally, cultural safety and humility, we found a lot of really important things. So participants described the importance of curiosity and questions and how these can actually be really positive things when we're thinking about cultural safety and humility. So Grace explained that you can't know about everybody's culture, like it's impossible to know everything. And this goes actually against arguments for cultural competency, which aim to really indulge oneself in another culture and invest oneself in another culture to understand. But she explains that we can't know this for everybody. So it's better to ask questions such as, what would you like? What would you not like and why? Because we're not all the same, as she says. And this phrase, not all the same, was also echoed by Harrison, who says that what's good for one is not good for all. So we can also see that heterogeneity is a big theme coming through, which is something that this study really wanted to explore. And Elijah also links a professional relationship to these types of questions and curiosities, which is interesting because a lot of people have assumed that race and ethnicity are conversations which should not necessarily be had in the workplace. And with recent training for cultural safety, we see it coming through. But for Black people, this is something that they really wanted to see more. So leadership and structure was a big theme also. And one of the participants, Bolu, was able to speak to this, as well as the theme of listening and feeling heard. So for leadership and structure, he actually explains a story that comes from one of his white colleagues and an encounter he had with them that was really positive for him. So this was in light of the Black Lives Matter and the George Floyd events that happened in 2020. And he explained that after this, there was no sort of discussion or acknowledgement in his meetings or with his manager to see how he was doing based on everything that had been going on in the media and personally. And he explains that one of his white colleagues actually came forward and asked if there had been any form of discussion, and particularly with his manager or with his leadership team. And for him, he felt that that was a really positive thing for her to check and see how he was doing. So here we see how colleagues can actually act as allies in areas where maybe leadership is lacking or where more needs to be done. And then he also reflects on times where he's had negative experiences and what people's responses have been after he's expressed that he's upset. So he says that the phrase, "I'm sorry if you're upset," is not a response that shows much empathy. And he feels that a more favorable response is to understand why someone is upset and apologize for behavior that has caused upset. And I think the difficult thing here is that everybody's background and experiences are different. And you're not always going to know what's going to upset someone, or you're not always going to understand their culture, as one of the participants explained. So that's why he proposes this idea of having safe spaces where people can learn what actually caused upset and learn to understand more how to not behave that way in the future. So one of the participants, Aaliyah, also discusses power dynamics and how this links to lived experience. So she explains that although someone may be of the same job status or same position on the org chart, as she says, her lived experience is not reflected by others. And she uses the fact that someone may be Caucasian as opposed to her who was Black. She explains that for the Caucasian person who grew up in Canada, that the culture is more likely to support them than support her. And she also explains that people would be less likely to identify with her and would be more likely to gravitate towards the Caucasian person because they have a similar cultural background and similar lived experience as well. So she explains that this leads to her having to do more and work harder, work faster, and using words that show, again, this idea of pressure. She also describes workplace training, and this is a really interesting point that she's made here. She says that for her perspective, when she hears the words cultural safety, she believes most people think of Indigenous people due to the training and education that currently goes on within the interior. And she explains that the lived experiences of people constitute both the health worker and the patient. So both health workers and patients need to have their lived experiences represented. But she believes that these training activities and education don't necessarily consider experiences or lived experiences through the lens of non-Indigenous minorities. And she believes that to be a current gap. And I think that is an interesting finding that this study presents as well. And Fela also discusses medical education. And there's a lot of things that he mentioned here. But to summarize, he believes that a lot of doctors particularly are not sure how things manifest in Black people. So certain symptoms or signs that may indicate disease, he feels that these are not really covered in medical education. So doctors graduate and are unable to actually recognize these signs. And he uses a phrase which I find really powerful. He says that lots of people learn to suffer since they're often dismissed by medical professionals who told them there's nothing wrong. I think this phrase, learning to suffer, it speaks to a lot of the Black experience, and it kind of has parallels with a lot of the history of colonialism and slavery and how the colonial narrative comes forward today to provide health inequalities as well. Elijah also discusses how professional development requires more cultural awareness and cultural diversity, because otherwise you would have professionals working in an era of global health, but only know about what's going on in their corner of the world. And I think it's interesting that he uses this phrase in the era of global health, because we see how immigration is something that affects all of us, from whether that's immigrating to a different country or knowing friends who have immigrated, or even having certain services that are able to run due to immigration, such as the healthcare service, the education sector. And this is interesting to think about as well. So a lot of different things covered there. We're rounding up now, but we're going to move on to the discussion. So these findings and results can be compared with the findings and results of the In Plain Sight report by Dr. Tapo Lafon. And this is quite a packed slide, but I will summarize it for you. So the first thing to think about is the participants of both studies. So the In Plain Sight report focuses on Indigenous individuals and their experiences. And we know both from evidence, from literature, and from personal accounts that the multi-generational original inhabitants of Canada are Indigenous individuals. However, in the New Voices study, which incorporates Black individuals, we found that there's great heterogeneity in people's origins. So some people have their multi-generational heritage rooted in Canada. They're born and raised there, as were their parents, grandparents. Some people immigrated there and are first generation or second generation immigrants. And you have other people who have a background of slavery, or other people who have a background of entering Canada as a free person in their history. Moving on to the stereotypes, in the In Plain Sight report, Dr. Tapo Lafon describes how a lot of Indigenous individuals are stereotyped as heavy drinkers or frequent users of the health service. And this is really something that is just really sad. And I think, unfortunately, the New Voices study also found multiple stereotypes, such as Black people being uneducated or aggressive. And it's interesting that both of these studies actually come together on these themes of suspicion and mistrust. So suspicion and mistrust of both Indigenous individuals and of Black individuals. For the In Plain Sight report, this led to many Indigenous individuals avoiding healthcare services or delaying presentation, which meant that their health outcomes eventually ended up being worse when they did present. In the New Voices study, this found that Black individuals often change their behavior in attempts to serve their white colleagues. And this actually reflects histories of slavery and exploitation that link Black people's worth to their work. And lastly, training and education. The In Plain Sight report found that there was great generalization of Indigenous healthcare into social determinants and culture, and there was a lot of inconsistency in the training between different regions. However, this was rarely linked to colonialism, and this didn't really link to the history of why Indigenous individuals' health outcomes have been, unfortunately, less substandard to the rest of the population. And this means that without linking it to colonialism, a lot of the context and the relevance is lost. Fortunately, though, the study did find that Indigenous individuals were benefiting from these safe spaces. The New Voices study found that Black individuals and their lived experiences were predominantly excluded from cultural safety training, and there was not enough accountability or prioritization of Black representation in medical education and continued professional development. And there was also a lack of these types of safe spaces for critical reflection and questions. So, to summarize the comparison, cultural safety can be thought of as the end outcome of no discrimination, prejudice, or racism in the healthcare setting. And we find throughout literature that cultural safety is predominantly regarded as an Indigenous specific concept, and the In Plain Sight report has little reference to cultural humility. It's important to think of all this in context and use the cultural humility framework as a way of being critical and acknowledging what has happened in the past and the outside influences of this. So when we think about cultural safety, we have to understand that cultural safety alongside cultural sensitivity and cultural competence have all been designed in light of Canada's colonial narrative, which predominantly focuses on white and Indigenous relations. But over time, we see that throughout the years, immigration and globalization has meant that Black individuals have been able to enter Canada and become part of that colonial narrative as well. So if we're including Black people as part of the colonial narrative, then surely they're included in this end result of cultural safety as well. So to achieve this, I have some brief recommendations for society and practice in light of this study. And it's important to think of these in context, as we explained, with critical and contextual consideration and focusing on listening to people and listening to their experiences. So the first recommendation is to build trust. So acknowledging this colonial narrative, including immigration and globalization and the important role that Black people play in this colonial narrative as well. It's really important to think about diversity and representation, not only celebrating this, but realizing how it can connect patients and healthcare workers. It's important to enhance education. So people should feel free to share their experiences and educate each other in safe spaces that are designed for learning to go on. And as I mentioned about celebrating diversity, it's important to also utilize this connection to improve patient outcomes. And also to extend leadership. So increasing Black representation at senior leadership and management levels. And this is also something that the In Plain Sight report explained, the need for Indigenous individuals to be at senior leadership levels and management levels. And a lot of participants from the study expressed a desire for mentorship and networking to progress in these leadership positions and achieve social mobility. So there's a need to be proactive in that. So in conclusion to this presentation, to this study, we find that Black and Indigenous individuals have unique contexts, they have unique stories and unique experiences that cannot go untold. And while they can't be explicitly compared, there are a lot of themes that overlap. We find that the theme of cultural sensitivity is Indigenous specific, and it's not applicable to Black individuals in terms of the context and the history. Cultural competency, unfortunately, is unable to fully encompass the heterogeneity of the Black experience. But this means that cultural safety and humility approaches can be used, which is a great thing. And they're actually required to uphold the unique desires and needs of Black individuals for their healthcare. To achieve this, we need to be intentional about building trust and being open and honest about the past and what has happened. And we also need to strive towards increasing Black representation in leadership and education. And training and education about safety, about cultural safety and humility needs to be more inclusive. People need to feel represented in the training that they receive. Thank you so much for listening to my presentation. Here are my details in the screen in case you'd like to get in touch with me. And these are my references as well. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Jemima. That was very powerful. We have unmute, or I'm not sure what the word is, but we've opened back up the chat box. So please feel free to enter your questions for Jemima in there. And we already have one fast off the gate. So great work. Where do you plan to publish this study?
That's a great question. Thank you so much for your question. I'm currently in discussion with Leslie and with my matric supervisor about this. We're hoping to try and publish it in an open access way so that people are able to access it. Not sure exactly which journal will be targeted yet, but we're also hoping to publish like a one-pager of the study in some form of IH, maybe intranet or something where people could access it in an open way. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, I think that'd be really great to continue sharing that knowledge that's been learned. Getting kudos in the chat.
I wanted to take the opportunity to also thank Shay Oyedele, Dr. Shay Oyedele, because she also was very helpful in coaching Jemima at the beginning and as we went through the thought processing on how to approach this study. But Jemima, just blown away actually by your study. And I want to share with everyone, she did this in like a super short time period. You are like the most focused student I've ever worked with. Like, it was phenomenal for you to get your ethics approval, do the interviews, do all your data analysis, and to be at this point to present today is a very impressive, top-notch work, Jemima.
Thank you so much, Leslie. Thank you. Yeah, I just echo your thanks to Shay. Like, I honestly appreciate both of you so much just for everything you've enabled me to do and just giving me a great balance of support and leadership and guidance, but also the freedom to really explore this topic and to give people the platform to speak. I think that was the most important thing for me in this study, was just giving people a platform and a voice to be able to share what they think, but also maintain that anonymity, as I discussed in the presentation, because I know that's really important.
I think we've had that theme this week, hey, Kim, where many of these embedded research projects are focused on giving voice to whomever the topic person is, like the healthcare workers or Black individuals. And what I'm seeing is that the research then becomes a part of the change, because people feel better after being able to give voice to their perspective or their experience. So I think that really highlights the benefit of research embedded in the health authority, just for the like sheer quality improvement of the experience for individuals.
Absolutely, absolutely. And we do have another question for you, Jemima. Sorry, scrolling. So first of all, what an amazing and powerful presentation. What advice would you have for other students wanting to do research with IH?
Wow. Yeah, I would say, like, if you're thinking about it, definitely do it, because it's a great opportunity. The advice I would offer, I guess, just using current events and current issues as a guide for what you want to do. Because I think with research, something that's really important is relevance, and how is this actually going to impact people, and what gaps are we trying to fill? And yeah, I think just kind of aligning that with your interest, because sometimes it will be a bit difficult, but I think if you genuinely have a passion and an interest in the subject, then it can get you through the difficulty. That's what I'd say.
And we have too an offer, I'm not sure if you already saw it, but that Eliza writes that she'd like to include this study in the next diversity and inclusion newsletter that goes IH-wide, and she offers her email. So,
I'll follow up with her, yeah.
Perfect.
And then once we have a one pager, we'll get that to you, Elisa.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you so much. That's fantastic.
And then we have, did your study, oh, sorry. So from Marilyn, I believe this is patient partner Marilyn, writes, South Africa designates people as Black, white, and colored. Did your study find these differences and how they apply to your report? Also, how do Black people perceive their place in the IH community?
Those are great questions. The first question, did you mention about, did the study find people talking about Black, white, and colored? That's a good question.
And did I talk about those differences and how would they apply to your report?
Okay. So yeah, people use a variety of terminology. Most participants described the word Black, and they would also use the word white. A lot of participants used the phrase people of color, and using that phrase, they were kind of talking about anyone who is not white when they use the phrase people of color. And I think it's interesting that like they included themselves in that phrase, but then also using the phrase Black meant that it was more individualized and specific. So more the phrase people of color that they tended to use. And please remind me, what was the second question?
No problem. How, and also how Black people perceive their place in the IH community?
Wow. I think it really varied between participants based on like who their community was and who was around them. So I know that some of the younger participants who were like of the more student-based age category, they felt like quite well supported, and the fact that they had quite an international community and international friendship group, they felt that there were people who understood their lived experiences and they felt like quite embedded in the community. But for people who had recently immigrated or recently moved to Canada, they didn't feel that type of connection or feel that they were as plugged into the community as someone who had been living here for quite a few years or had family here.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Thank you. And then we have another comment saying this is a highly informative study and can lend value and empower the need for compassionate leadership, which I completely agree. I would love for Jemima to be able to share this with the Rural Coordination Center of BC Network, and that, and I'm sorry I can't see the attendee's name, but they said that they'll reach out. And to anybody as well, my email is underneath my head, but also you can email research@interiorhealth.ca, and I'm happy to facilitate connection to Jemima and or Leslie anytime.
Thank you.
Of course. Oh, and then we have a question about the participants' names. Someone says, I saw a participant's name with quotes, and I usually don't see that in presentations or in qualitative articles. Was there a specific reason for that? Oh, and then somebody else responds, the names are pseudonyms.
Yeah.
Which
I just clarified that. But I also,
great.
I mean, and Jemima, you can speak to that around, like, I think when we do report qualitative data, we do attribute pseudonyms because having a name to a quote is more powerful because these are people and these are their experiences, right?
Yeah, I completely agree, Leslie. I think that's something that the study really wanted to accomplish, because especially the need for qualitative data. I think with quantitative, it's thinking about maybe more of a public health or population approach, looking at things at the broader scale, which like we need, but then also looking at the smaller scale sometimes this study, for example, had 9 participants. And even with just 9, the amount of data was like overwhelming. But I think when you have fewer participants who are speaking and giving quotes and things like that, it can be difficult to kind of quantify that and see it as coming from an actual person with actual experiences. So the whole point of giving the participants pseudonyms was for you to be able to read it as someone who is kind of sharing their story and make it a bit more personal and a bit more relatable.
I agree. And I have to say, Jemima, the artwork throughout your presentation was very powerful too. What prompted you and just for you to include that?
Thank you. No, I do have to admit that I had a slide at the end with the credits, so I didn't draw the artwork myself, but I was really drawn to that particular artwork because I think just like mentioned before about the personalization and making it making people able to really feel that it's personal and coming from people. I think it can also be difficult to do that online and like virtually through a screen. So just having like those silhouettes or those pictures where like you can't quite make out who it is, but maybe it looks like someone you know or someone you've seen. That was something that I found really striking when I saw the artwork. So I thought I wanted to include it in my presentation.
And I guess too, I have another question, which is I'm sure on everybody's mind, which is how has this research informed your practice?
Wow, good question. I think for me, like coming from my own experience of being like in the healthcare profession and even experiencing discrimination and prejudice done towards me in the healthcare setting, I was thinking, I wonder how other people's experiences are and how other people experience this and what their thoughts are, their perceptions. And I really wanted to get it from not only the healthcare worker perspective, but also the service recipient or patient perspective. Because I think there's a lot of power dynamics that can go on. For example, the type of racism that a health worker experiences may be different from that of a patient due to the natural power dynamics that exist in that scenario. So I think looking at like the similarities, but also the differences between experiences for both groups. That's kind of, so like linking that to my practice, it's made me think about like when I'm talking to a patient who is like an ethnic minority in the UK, like myself, I'm thinking of their background, their experiences, how that links to their symptoms and their history and how everything's presenting, the different social circumstances that have led to this disease or this presentation. But also when talking to my superiors and healthcare workers and colleagues, thinking about this person is not only like above me in terms of like they're my teacher or they're my lecturer or something, but they also are a person and they have feelings and they have experiences. And I think just seeing people as people is something which has benefited me in my practice so far. Yeah, I hope that makes sense.
I think those are very wise words. And I think that's something, I think that's a perfect way to actually end this conversation, because that's very beautiful.
I'm going to continue to try and recruit Jemima to be a physician here in the interior, because I think we would be so fortunate to have someone so, you're so wise, Jemima, for someone so young. So thank you so much for bringing that incredible piece of work together. As a student, it blew me away. It's making me speechless. So tremendous job. And Lottie, send along her thank you as well, and praises. So thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
I agree with Lottie's comment of saying you did an admirable job. So well done. It was a pleasure to have you as part of the team for the short time we did, and we look forward to all that's to come. Please stay in good touch, and then all the further knowledge translation work that'll come out of this study too, and inform further learnings to come. So thank you both. Supreme thanks Jemima, our presenter, and Leslie, my co-host. It was a true pleasure and honor, and I look forward to connecting again really soon. And we're gonna go right into our next one, folks. So thank you both so much. To those that are just joining, welcome to IH Research Week 2021. My name is Kim Peek. Some housekeeping items. Please note that during the presentation, the chat box will be disabled, but at the end is a question and answer period where attendees can ask their questions and communicate with the presenters through the chat box. Every presentation throughout this week will be recorded, and links to these recordings will be sent to you directly when they're posted online. It's a pleasure to introduce the next and final presentation of the day, titled Addressing Illicit Drug Toxicity Surveillance Gaps Using Chart Reviews. Our presenters are Ornella Wafo, Epidemiologist for the IH Epidemiology and Surveillance Unit, Karin Goodison, IH Medical Health Officer, and Andrew Kerr, Practice Lead for IH Mental Health and Substance Use Portfolio. Thank you, folks. The spotlight is yours.
Thank you for that, Kim. I will just go ahead and share my screen for everyone to see. Okay. Good morning, everyone. Thanks again, Kim, for your introduction. So my name is Ornella Wafo, and I'm joined today by my colleagues, Dr. Karin Goodison, as well as Andrew Kerr, to present on the chart review project that was conducted here at IH to address illicit drug toxicity surveillance gaps in interior BC. So before I dive into the presentation, I wanted to start with a land acknowledgement. So we recognize and acknowledge that we're collectively gathered on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of the 7 interior First Nations, where we all live, learn, collaborate, and work together. This region is also home to 15 chartered Métis communities. It is with humility and gratitude that we continue to strengthen our relationship with First Nation, Métis, and Inuit peoples across the interior. So again, before diving into the details of the presentation, we wanted to disclose that we have no potential or actual conflicts of interest in relation to this presentation and work, and we have no relevant financial relationships with commercial interests. So to begin, I want to give you all an overview of what to expect in this presentation. To begin, I will present on learning objectives, so what we are hoping for the audience to take away from this presentation. Then I'll dive into the background and context. Then my apologies. We will dive into the background and context for this particular project. And then finally, we'll actually go through the details of the chart review project. So looking at the aims and goals, the structure and the process, the findings and recommendations, lessons learned, as well as next steps. So in terms of learning objectives for our audience today, we want to start with giving you an overview of what is a chart review, what, why, and how it was conducted, particularly here within IH. Also, we want to talk or showcase an example of untraditional/applied research, because recognizing that this is Research Week, this particular project does not fall under the traditional definition of research. It's very much applied and aims to inform and improve service provision. So it's more so along the lines of quality improvement. We also want to showcase collaborative partnerships that underlie this particular project and how different departments within IH came together in order to make this possible. And finally, there will also be conversations around data, specifically around data governance, data quality, and data completeness as it pertains to this project and the analyses that ensued from it. So before diving into the chart review project, allow me to present to you some background information around the poison drug crisis across BC. So this particular figure showcases the top 15 causes of death in BC in 2020. And I don't know if you can see very clearly from the image, if it's zoomed in enough, but on the left, that is the ranking of the top 15 causes of death in terms of percentages of total deaths. And on the right, in terms of percentages of total potential years of life lost. So if we look at illicit drug toxicity, which was the previous language for the poison drug crisis, you see that it ranked 5th in BC in 2020, first being malignant cancers. However, when we consider this particular cause of death in terms of potential years of life lost, it ranks 2nd. And this is because the median and average ages at which people are lost due to poison drugs is only 43 years old. So this is much lower than the life expectancy both in BC and in Canada overall. And for reference as well, there is the COVID-19 ranking, both in terms of percentage of total deaths, as well as percentage of total potential years of life lost. So to provide you with more context as well around what we see provincially in terms of the actual numbers, this slide showcases the deaths and death rates per year in BC from the mid-90s until 2021. So what you see here is that based on the data that was collected since the mid-90s, the count of deaths as well as death rates for poison drugs were very low. In 1995 being 217 deaths in total, and a rate of 5.7 deaths per 100,000 of the population in the province. And this rate and count stayed pretty low, but started rising around 2014, 2015. And in 2016, the first public health emergency was declared for poison drugs. And in response to that, IH implemented a number of different intervention strategies and harm reduction strategies across the interior. And these were implemented over the course of the following years and led to the plateauing of the counts of deaths as well as the death rate between 2017 and 2018, and the decrease that you see as well in 2019. Unfortunately, however, as you can see from the figure, this trend was reversed in 2020, during which the second public health emergency was declared, so the COVID-19 public health emergency. As you can see, not only did the counts and rates rise back up, they exceeded all the historical records. And this data is up until July of 2021. So even though we don't have the full data for 2021 yet, as the year has not come to an end, you can see from the solid line that the projected rate, so the projected annual rate for 2021 is meant to be even higher than 2020, hence the newest historical record. Now, looking at the geographic distribution of the poison drug crisis within IH, what you see on the left is the distribution of rates, so death rates per 100,000 of the population by HSDA, so Health Service Delivery Area in 2020, and then the most recent one in July 2021. So you can see that across the 4 HSDAs in IH, the Thompson Caribou Shuswap, here TCS, is the most affected, followed by the Okanagan, OK, but the KB, so Kootenay Boundary and East Kootenays, are not unaffected either. What you see, however, in July 2021 is an exacerbation of the rates that were already high, particularly in Thompson Caribou Shuswap, once again TCS. There was also a notable increase, as you can see, in Kootenay Boundaries, where the color now matches the color in the Okanagan KB. While in East Kootenays, the numbers, at least the rate, is still within the range in 2020. However, overall, there has been an increase in the impact of the poison drug crisis across IH. More again about the background and context, it is important to note that these individuals who unfortunately succumb to a fatal overdose have had engagement with healthcare services before their death. In 2018, an investigation by the BC Coroner's Service revealed that in about, I think, 8 out of 10 people who died due to poison drugs in the interior had had an interaction with healthcare services in the year before their death. So there's definitely an interaction with this population and opportunities to engage with them and mitigate the risks. So in light of all of this, a retrospective medical chart review was completed in 2020 to address surveillance gaps and to inform strategies and interventions that will reduce poison drug deaths. So now the chart review project, what does it entail? So in essence, it entails a review of medical charts, health and demographic records of individuals who experience a fatal overdose with a history of engagement with services within the interior. So we identified, as you can see here, some core aims and goals that we're hoping to achieve through the project. The first aim being to examine the characteristics and circumstances of people who died from an overdose, as well as their healthcare interactions within 2 years leading up to their death, as well as look into barriers to service, such as experiences of stigma associated with substance use. And some of the goals, or the foundational goals that we're looking to address or to accomplish in this case, were to uncover patterns and trends that cannot be teased out from regular surveillance data as well as methods, identify limitations and areas of opportunities within ICE services and structure, again, recognizing the engagement with ICE services among the people who are deceased due to poison drugs, and also identify stakeholders for engagement and partnership so that we can collaboratively address and mitigate the risk and impact of the poison drug crisis within the interior. Karin.
Great, thanks, Ornella. So basically this involved collaborations across the health authority. And, we had our epidemiology and surveillance unit, which was critical to coordinating, gathering information, learning from other health authorities, what they had learned from similar chart reviews. Then we obviously used our health record services to assist in the gathering of records that would enable us to review the charts. The research team was able to provide members of their team to help us look at that, to help us physically review the charts, and that was a fair bit of work. Then mental health and substance use network, obviously this work is very intricately connected to the work of the overdose response, which sits under MHSU, and Andrew Kerr, who will be speaking next, was helping lead that portion of the work. We had harm reduction coordinators bringing their lens into this and helping review charts as well, and the population health office or the medical health officers were also collaborating. So this really was an effort by many. So what the different elements were here was, we had to identify the population that we would be doing chart reviews on, determine the scope of project and what data elements would be collected. And so we used our entire team to be doing that work. The health records services helped provide the actual records and charts. The research team did the data collection. Then our EPI surveillance unit did the data extraction and analysis to enable us to determine the elements that we could use to bring back to the steering committee for knowledge translation and recommendations. So this was really a quality improvement process. So it's a little bit different than your standard research approach, but we still do go through ethics for this. So we applied to Alberta Research Ethics Community Consensus Initiative, so had the ARECI approval, also the second opinion review, a privacy impact assessment, and we also consulted with our data steward for the use of ASI, or our Aboriginal self-identifier, in this project, as we felt this was an important element to capture. Because we were not doing research, the REB was not required. So what was the first element, which is population and scope? So we have a number of data sources. So first of all, we get a list because during the public health emergency, a list of all people who die from a illicit toxicity death or poison drug supply are brought forward to us. So we were able to use those names and then use the following data sources, such as Meditech, our MHSU records, and profile and paper charts to gather information on these individuals. The population was comprised of 380 people whom we could access the appropriate information from 270 of those. Eligibility, basically they had to be identified by the coroner's office as having their cause of death due to poison drugs. They had to have a date of death between our study time, which was November 1st of 2017 to October 31st of 2019. They did have to have a PHN so that we could search their records appropriately. And our goal was to look at those who had had an interaction with our healthcare services within a year prior to their death. So, as we outlined before, the data sources were Meditech, MHSU, and profile and paper charts. So that part was straightforward as far as enabling us to get access to that. We already had access through our MHSU stakeholders and our population health stakeholders to these data sources. For the scope of data, what we really wanted to do was look at any interactions that occurred to the healthcare system and gather charts from anyone who was had an interaction within 2 years prior to death, or gather their last 30 interactions that were prior to their death. The chart localization was way more fun than we expected. Electronic records were very straightforward. We were able to access them. So we had the name and PHN of the decedent, and we were able to access an electronic record on them. However, paper charts, some were stored at the facility where the person was deceased. Others were tucked away in storage containers across the health authority. So this involved quite a bit of work to gather those charts and transport them to a place where the records could be reviewed. So then moving into the process of the actual data collection and chart review, we were able to get excellent support from the clinical research team here in IH, and we used clinical research coordinators who have an RN background, so that was perfect, so they could read the charts and gather the appropriate elements from the chart. And in order to gather those elements, we had worked in advance to develop a tool for collecting that, and that was the whole team really looking at what work had been done previously, what our team's questions were as we looked to this to develop this tool that could be used to gather the information. Our timing was tricky. As you can see, we started this in March of 2020, which aligns with COVID. So we had started this just as our organization was turning its head toward the COVID response. So it took us a bit longer than we expected, but the information got collected from March to September of 2020. The data quality was reviewed. We had specific training on how to gather the information from the chart, and then inter-rater reliability assessments were done to ensure that all of those who were gathering the data were gathering it in a consistent and reliable manner. So what we ended up having was 270 individuals with a date of death that was within the timelines that we had from 2017 to 2019. And what we wanted to do once we had those names was to look back to review the interactions that they had had within 1 year of their date of death. So if they had come in to an emergency service, if they'd had MHSU services, we looked at those interactions in order to try to understand more about those interactions to help us determine what interventions would be effective to help people, protect people from potential of overdosing. So we then had the demographics of those individuals. We had those specific interactions, and that enabled us to transcribe the information through that form. And then our EPI team took over with using a Adobe Pro extraction, with renaming the variables, removing identifiers, and crosswalking the information to enable the synthesis of the data and processing of the data into themes descriptive summaries, and stratified analysis. And this was a significant amount of work. We were able, luckily, to have a full-time epidemiologist at the time who was hired for this project. And actually, the work of that was recognized across the organization and enabled us to have Ornella in her current role now. Next slide. And now I'll hand over to Andrew.
Thanks, Karin. Hi, everybody. I'm Andrew Kerr, and I'm a practice lead from the Mental Health and Substance Use Network. And so after this, incredible effort that happened over many months and involving many hours and many people and many meetings, there are, of course, a lot of really rich findings and very detailed findings. And while this presentation here isn't about reviewing the findings, what's worthy, there's one particular finding that really jumped out at us, and it really showed that there were 3 distinct populations within this particular cohort. So if you remember from a few slides ago, there were just over 100 files that were not included in this chart review because there was no evidence of an interaction with an interior health service or facility within the time frame. So this represents a number of people who died from an overdose who were not connected with interior health in any way, shape, or form within the year prior to their death. And then for those people who did have received services from interior health, there was a spectrum between people who were very engaged and regularly seeing their mental health counselor, regularly seeing their OAT physician, accessing emergency department for mental health or substance use or other emergencies that are happening in their lives. And then a number of people where there's intermittent services and evidence of intermittent support for people. Next slide, please. And one of the variables, we collected data on quite a lot of different data variables. And one particular one that was included is the ASI variable that Karin spoke to earlier. And this is a field that is asked anytime somebody goes to any interior health service, any interior health facility. It's asked at registration, same as they're verifying a person's demographic information and their next of kin. This is one of the questions that a person is asked, where they can choose. It's a voluntary field. They can choose to identify as First Nations, Métis, or Inuit. And so because this information exists in the system, it allows for some analysis of people who identify as Aboriginal. Now, of course, in having this variable, we also have to recognize that the impact of overdose affects Aboriginal peoples differently than the larger population, and we see that's pretty well known from lots of the published reports that come from the BC Coroner Service and the First Nations Health Authority, where there's one trend or one kind of risk profile for people who die from overdose across the whole province, and then it looks quite different for people who are Aboriginal as what we see in the First Nations Health Authority data. So in using this analysis and sharing this analysis, we're going to be doing this in a very careful way, aligning with the First Nations principles of the OCAP, the ownership, control, access, and permission, as well as the Métis Nation BC frameworks, very similar to the OCAP. And then, of course, we're going to be working within Interior Health's own data governance structure for the use of the ASI. And then as the findings and the recommendations, as we start to roll those out and start to put the rubber on the road, so to speak, then we're going to be able to do that in a very intentional way with Aboriginal communities. So this is a big focus of our work right now of taking all this rich data and the rich findings and the wonderful analysis that Ornella has done for us, and really starting to make this more than just having interesting data that kind of fills a gap in higher level overdose surveillance. There's some really powerful information that we can and need to get out to decision makers and programs across health authority to inform practice improvements and inform new practices potentially for people. And so what we've done so far is there's, of course, this very detailed report that was created at the end of the data collection cycle that highlighted a number of the trends. In presenting this to some targeted tables like the Overdose Emergency Task Force and within the Mental Health and Substance Use Network, there's a one-page summary of all of the findings and the process of it, and then an accompanying presentation that goes along with that. And taking all the findings and trying to translate these into actual practice recommendations and kind of knowledge translation supports and education supports and recommendations for people to bring to their clinical settings. You know, that's a very important stage. It's a very detailed stage, and we're doing a lot of that now, and we're coordinating with the Aboriginal mental wellness team on the Mental Health and Substance Use Network to ensure that, you know, the cultural safety and the importance of you know, seeing these findings and the practice recommendations as it pertains to Aboriginal peoples. That's going to be a really key component of this knowledge product, and as well as aligning the practice recommendations with the new substance use interior health substance use framework that's recently been endorsed by our senior executive team. There's going to be a lot of overlap between what the practice recommendations from this chart review are and what the substance use framework is also bringing to the organization. And we were super lucky over the summer to have a MSW student from UBC Okanagan to help with some of the initial writing of that document. And of course, in doing this, it's not just one person alone writing all this. It's a number of people who are and are still going to contribute to the creation of this pretty robust practice recommendations document that's going to be rolled out everywhere. And so we need to make sure that the recommendations are relevant to everyone who's going to be reading those. And then, of course, all of this information is going to inform decision making and quality improvement. And so as we're kind of wrapping up the presentation, you know, going through this process over the last year and a half, it's been incredibly valuable. As has been highlighted, you know, it's filled in the gaps a little bit from kind of seeing high level, you know, statistical information about overdoses, where, you know, look at the charts and graphs that were shown at the beginning. Those are really important to understand. The impact of overdose in our province and in our communities. But in doing this much more detailed chart review process, it brings us closer to the people who are impacted by this and what people experience in their lives and how people seek healthcare and seek help in times of crisis and as they kind of, you know, experience triggers and experience the harms of substance use disorders. As Karin mentioned, you know, COVID pulled us all in a number of different ways, and very soon after the start of the COVID pandemic, we also learned that the overdose emergency also got really bad. So thankfully, we were all able to, you know, dually prioritize our time and keep this really important work moving forward. When it comes to looking in the actual charts, you know, I think we find that the clinical documentation that clinicians do, you know, whether that's for community programs or within emergency departments or acute care, you know, typically are a little bit more transactional in nature and kind of focus on, you know, what's the presenting problem, what was the intervention, what was the recommended follow-up. And while we were looking for lots of information about people's social determinants of health and kind of their social situations, there were unfortunately some gaps in some of the clinical information about that. And Ornella and her team, they did an incredible job, you know, really digging into the data and really understanding, you know, the different patterns and the different trends. And we hope to be able to share some of this at a future date. One of the great things for me being part of this project and being part of the team is just the strengths of all of our different perspectives and our experience and our wisdom and knowledge bring to this. And the working group meetings, they're really incredible because we all work really well together, and because we all work from different perspectives and different lenses, you know, that makes this work and this whole project that much stronger. And we're going to be doing a lot more work about, you know, actually getting the information and getting the practice recommendations out to people. Where hopefully we'll see that coming in the coming months here. And then the last one here is just recognizing that in doing the chart review on these 270 people that the project cohort captured, that the findings are not going to be generalizable to every single person within interior health. So that's just, you know, I think an important caveat of this is that the findings are representative of the people within the cohort. And while anecdotally, we might know that that things might be applicable to larger populations, some of the ongoing work that still needs to be done is going to be looking at bringing this to a larger population.
Thank you, Andrew. So in terms of next steps, given all the value that was found in the chart review project, we endeavored to look into ways to continue. And we are quite happy to share that we were successful in receiving funding from the Public Health Agency of Canada in order to continue the chart review project. So we plan to, rather than doing like a one-off, we plan to incorporate more recent as well as ongoing chart reviews into the broader surveillance approach for the overdose portfolio here at IH in order to better understand the public health emergency in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic and pandemic recovery, and also to keep up with changing trends and patterns and to be a bit more responsive and proactive in terms of the information that we have around this particular public health emergency. So hopefully, as we incorporate it in our surveillance strategy, we will be able to have a lot more insights from it and continue to improve the practice, improve either current practice recommendations or future practice recommendations, and overall the service provision within IH. So finally, before just closing, we wanted to acknowledge all the different individuals who have been involved with this work. Even though it's Karin, myself, and Andrew who are presenting today, a lot of different people were involved in this work, so it's important to recognize all of their contributions. And once again, as you can see, they span not just multiple departments and groups within IH, but also externally. So within IH, it's important to recognize the members of our team or the Greater IH within the Population Health Department, as well as Medical Health Officer, the Epidemiology and Surveillance Unit, Health Record Services Team, the Research Team, the MHSU Network, as well as external partners, particularly Vancouver Coastal Health and Fraser Health Authorities, from these particular health authorities had conducted chart reviews previously. So we're able to get a lot of insights and advice from them as we developed our own chart review project. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ornella, Andrew, and Karin. We're going to open up the chat box, and please feel free, folks, to enter any questions or thoughts you have for the panelists in there, and I'll be happy to facilitate them. I have something off the bat that I was thinking as you guys were speaking. So this project was, a multi-stakeholder approach that involved, many different folks in many different departments. How would you see that going forward for this project? How would you foresee? Would you foresee engaging more stakeholders? Would you engage in a different way? Yeah, just further thoughts and expansion on that.
I can take the first crack. Because we're about to launch into this knowledge translation stage, I think we're going to be really careful and kind of thorough in preparing the practice recommendations and the supporting education and supporting knowledge piece for people. So I foresee us in the fall here, engaging a lot more different tables and a lot more different people who are much more closely connected to the different operational departments and the different programs and facilities to ensure that the needs of this practice recommendations document is going to meet the needs of their clinical areas.
Just adding on to that, in terms of the new phase of the chart review project that we're planning to also start this fall, so a lot of simultaneous work going on. One change that we plan to do in terms of stakeholder engagement is to get peers involved within the steering committee so that we can have those voices, and this would be something new compared to the first chart review project.
So peers, can you expand on that? Peers as patient partners or those with lived experience? Is that what you mean?
Yes, that's right. Persons with lived experience, so that it can provide the very necessary voices into the interpretation of the data or even guidance around analysis that could be conducted, and also support hopefully with the practice recommendations, be it from this stage or from the next phase once we start that new phase of the chart review project.
Wonderful. Wonderful.
And I'll just add an area that we're finding challenging, and it's been challenging in other things, is the Aboriginal self-identification, which provides us really great information. But we've, as this work has gone forward, we engaged early and then had some changes in people who are there and how our organization is looking at Aboriginal health as well. So just sort of following organizational change as you're working on a research project can also bring forth challenges, and the recognition of data, the control and empowering of control of data around our Aboriginal population is always an interesting challenge for research work.
We have a couple questions in the chat, so I'll read those out to you guys. What an excellent QI initiative that spotlights how QI can contribute to a learning health system, the connectedness of data, knowledge, performance within healthcare. The question is, would a single/integrated electronic health record across all providers reduce the administrative burden of extracting the data? I like that question.
It's Andrew. I can start. So, I think, it's a really good point, and I know there's lots of work about having better integrated systems. I think of many of the OAT clinics that are supported by Interior Health. They use the profile EMR, where clinical information that's entered in there is not accessible to people who are viewing that same patient information within Meditech, and vice versa. So I think there absolutely are opportunities to integrate other systems. I think one of the limitations of the data as well is we only see the Interior Health information. So some of the other data sources that we're not able to access as part of this chart review include like PharmaNet prescription records. So like, what, as interesting as it would be to see like prescribing patterns for people who died if they were on opioid agonist treatments or had other kind of common prescriptions, that's a data source that we didn't have access to, as well as other private physician primary care EMRs, clinical systems used by so many community agencies. There's lots of great information, but unfortunately walls between lots of the organizations.
Anything to add, Ornella, Karin?
Well, yeah, I just added in there a comment about, even just the acute care element was inconsistent. So we would find some acute care sites had excellent charting and everything was there with reports and records, and others, there was, ED visits we couldn't see, or, we could tell they'd been there, but that's all. Then we had to gather the paper records. So that piece was obviously made it more challenging. So, of course, this would be amazing to have it all easily accessible electronically.
Mm-hmm. And then you're getting kudos as well, I should say that. So this question is for Karin, but I'm sure it's applicable to the group. From your perspective, how do you think COVID has impacted this this first pandemic, and assuming the first wave? Oh, you're on mute.
So sorry, how COVID has impacted the drug poisoning emergency? I just want to make sure I'm getting the question. Yeah, no, well, absolutely. They are, we're actually calling it dual public health emergencies, and they're very intersected. As you can see from that first slide, we see that, we have a population that is already marginalized and whom we're saying, the safest thing to do is to be close to each other and look after each other. And this is how you respond to an overdose, keep an eye on each other, blah, blah, blah. And then we bring in COVID, which says, stay away from each other and be on your own. And so it absolutely is a challenge. We saw differences in our services. We saw, difficulty accessing services for a population that already has challenges accessing services. So I do think there are additional barriers that come from this. And we also see even the risk of an overdose death increasing related to COVID, because both of these things are impacting our breathing. So, that sort of dueling physiology as well to increase the risk of overdose. So very strong overlap.
And if I could add to that, Karin, so what we've come to understand in the last year and a half too is that the illicit drug supply itself has become more toxic than ever. So seeing extreme concentrations of fentanyl and seeing illicit benzodiazepines within the drug supply. So the actual drug supply has changed, that's the main thing that's leading to the deaths. And all of the work that we're doing, it's really difficult to pour our hearts into this work every day to still see, the next month's numbers, not going down and in fact going higher and higher and higher. So we're doing lots of great work, but because of the illicit drug supply being so dangerous for people right now, that's the biggest thing.
Absolutely. And I almost missed a question, so sorry, bouncing back to it. Will this roll out, so this information, will it roll out to external caregivers such as ambulance attendants, responders, and Indigenous communities?
So, Andrew, do you want to take a stab at that, or would you like me to go ahead?
Well, I can start and then you could add on. So our initial target group for creating these knowledge products is in internal interior health programs and services. And then I think as we continue to learn more through kind of like the ongoing chart review process, I think there's going to be need to share this with, the larger interior health and the larger region to contribute to kind of the larger knowledge base.
Yeah, and I'll just add in that, other health authorities that have done this have used the information to drive medical health officer reports. And I do think there is a lot of value in sharing the knowledge externally, as Andrew has stated.
Well, and I guess while folks are pondering further questions, I would pose a question to the group, which would be how this project, this interlinkage between QI and research, how it's really changed your scope and your work going forward. How has this knowledge changed your work and your practice?
Well, for me personally, having worked as a social worker in acute care, having worked as a clinician on the supervised consumption site and responded to quite a number of overdoses and experiencing the death of clients from overdose, and then now being in a role where the work that I'm doing and kind of the knowledge that I'm able to bring to this work and kind of influence change at a system level, for me, that's the real reward of doing this work. And I think, the QI perspective, it recognizes that, we're not doing crappy work out there. We're doing really, really good work. And there are lots of really compassionate, really incredible people who are supporting people at risk of overdose. And through doing work like this, we're able to amplify that work and make our services, make our facilities safer for people who experience overdose and have opioid use disorders.
If I can add on to that, I would say that for me, given that I do a lot of the database of things, is the recognition that even though statistics are important, they don't happen in a vacuum. There's a bigger story and there's a bigger context behind it, which is really important to understand in order to address this statistic in a way that is not only effective, but also culturally sensitive and safe. So to have that really comprehensive understanding of what is really happening and all the different determinants that feed into the problem, because it's not just one thing. It's so multifaceted. So another thing that I would really advocate in terms of this kind of project is that because it brings in so many different facets and lens, it allows the integration of the different teams who are working on this particular portfolio, but usually independently. So the bringing of all these voices together creates a kind of synergy in terms of understanding of what the problem is, understanding of what the different stakeholders are working, the role that they're playing in terms of response to this particular public health emergency, and how to really coordinate that effort so that the joint or collaborative effort really hits all the points that it needs to hit in a way that is not only effective, but also efficient.
And I can add as well. I mean, I think that what I really enjoyed about this was the team perspective, the different perspectives, and some of the big elements that I've always found hard to, we talk about stigma, but we often can't say, oh, there it is. And so we were looking in this project at how to more objectively look at stigma as we reviewed the charts. And that was, to me, a very interesting component of this work. And I look forward to seeing how that will potentially drive some change across the organization and further.
And I guess too, a further question to add on to the project itself, and when we talk about having patient partners or lived experience voices in the steering committee or in the, I'm sorry, I can't recall the term, but in the group itself, I wonder how equity, diversity, and inclusion will be considered in that, and if there's been further thought on that just yet.
So I can take a stab at that, and Andrew, please fill in any gaps. So we're looking ideally, right, while we're just in the process of recruiting, so that's not really been established yet. But as the team, you were right, the steering committee talked about this, there were particular variables or particular qualities that we really wanted to have or to be represented in terms of voices. So we wanted at least one of the peers to be a female. And then we also wanted at least one of them to at least self-identify as Aboriginal so that we can also have that voice there. So those are two of the elements that I'm thinking about in terms of equity as well as diversity and inclusion.
And just to add, so in having the diversity of the actual people being there, the other important thing is that these are people with lived experience of substance use, many of whom have had an overdose themselves, many of whom have responded to overdoses, seen their friends, seen their family members die from overdose. So in including that level of experience in this work, we also have to ensure that their own safety is built into the project and is built into kind of the larger peer inclusion and engagement strategies that we use.
Thank you. I wonder too, so looking back, I can see that 270 270 participants, I believe, was the total. Do you have more information about whether these come from our rural and remote communities or whether these come from larger centers? And if so, if there's considerations for including rural and remote communities moving forward?
I can take that question, and Andrew, please fill in anything I may forget. So we did do an analysis to look at the LG, to look at health area of residence as well as of death. And I'm happy to say that there was a fair distribution across the LG size categories, so from large urban all the way until rural remote. However, the majority of the individuals were within large urban, which also matches the statistics for poison drug deaths, where most people unfortunately are associated with the large urban area. But yes, there was fair representation across, or representation that matches the overall statistics in terms of geography size, as well as the 4 different health service delivery areas. All of them were represented in the data as well.
And just to help the group understand, so while the highest numbers of overdose deaths occur in the larger population centers, that's typically where the investment for supervised consumption sites and introducing new services, they tend to have been invested in the larger communities. But last summer, when we did see some increases in overdose activity in rural and remote communities, the BC Ministry of Health actually did some very targeted investment due to the increased overdose activity. And so we saw some brand new services of episodic overdose prevention services and nurse prescribing of Suboxone now exist in really small communities like Lillooet and 100 Mile House and Sparwood, these communities that have really, really small healthcare teams to begin with, now have this, substance use champion and these services in these communities that have never existed there before.
And I will add, I'm really interested in the urban-rural perspectives, and we really tried hard at the outset of this to make sure we included that perspective. One of the barriers we did run into was accessing charts in the rural areas was far more challenging than it was in the urban areas, partly because of electronic systems. So that actually created a bit of a barrier to understanding some of those. I think there were a few charts we were unable to review because we actually couldn't physically get them to our reviewers. So as we look forward into the upcoming years, that'll be something we want to ensure that we're capturing in this next phase, because as the charts, we'll be able to do it in real time. So we'll have more success, I think, in ensuring we can gather all those charts. And we are seeing a trend towards, more rurality impacts in this emergency as we move forward. So that'll be really important to take a deeper look into.
Right. And
Please.
just from my next question, I just wanted to add that even though the numbers are higher in large urban areas, it's also because the population size is bigger in large urban areas. That's why the numbers would also naturally be higher. But like Karin just mentioned, we've been seeing over the course of the last couple months, actually mostly 2021, an increase in impact in rural and remote communities.
Thank you. We have a question from Marilyn, and she says, how do you see the projected decrease in naloxone kit availability affecting the at-risk population?
Andrew, do you want to start and then I'll follow?
Yeah, well, from what I understand, the take-home naloxone program, this is the one that provides these kits here that are available in every interior health community, that the BC Centre for Disease Control that leads the distribution of that program, they've been delivering more naloxone kits than ever across the whole province. And in fact, this past spring, they sent out their 1 millionth naloxone kits since the overdose emergency, and I'm not aware of a decrease in access to the injectable naloxone kits. I know that there was a media story about the nasal naloxone kits that police officers carry, which is a separate program from the larger provincial naloxone distribution. Karin, anything else to add there?
That was exactly what I was going to say. I think the media maybe has misled us. We actually don't anticipate any challenges at the moment to naloxone kit availability for the programs that we have within BC.
Yeah, and to add to that too, so nasal naloxone is available for First Nations people and funded through the First Nations Health Authority, and they too have really been, oh, look at the little bone. The First Nations Health Authority has really been supporting communities to increase the distribution of nasal naloxone across First Nations communities and health centers all across the province.
Thank you both. And then a question to wrap it up, and it's to each of you individually. What is your advice to others that are thinking about doing research with IH or in IH?
Well, I can start, and so for me, I think it's the strength of so many different perspectives. Of, I'm a social worker by trade and worked in mental health and substance use for my whole career, and anytime I have an interest or curiosity about something, I don't have to go very far to find people with expertise in different areas than me. If I'm, want to dive into the literature, I don't have to reach far to, find the library services or go searching myself on lots of the journal websites and stuff like that. And then, research department, quality department, there are so many people with incredible expertise and a willingness to help me learn to do things in new ways and to be able to look at information, interpret information, and turn those learnings into like practice. So that's the strength for me.
And my big learning was I haven't to lean on others who've had that experience. I mean, I think we learned a lot as we went. We had to be very patient at some of the stages, but things did come together, and we've ended up with a really great result at the end, and it's turned into another project. So I actually think, it's sort of that, it's using other stakeholders within the organization and even outside the organization to navigate your way if you're not that familiar with research and wanting to jump in.
I'll just add to what they said and share that our project is not traditional research. So for the teams across the Interior Health Authority, who when they think about research think very, very clinical or in the lab or something like that, I hope that should they be watching this or hear about this, they can see that there are different forms of research and there are different ways for different teams to come together in order to investigate a particular question and come up with resolutions that, again, don't necessarily have to fall within the traditional realm of research, which may not be as applicable to them. So like Karin and Andrew said, there's such a wealth of insight and expertise and information across the health authority. So it would be great for different teams to reach out to other teams, learn what they're doing. And through those conversations, there's so many opportunities to identify potential ways to collaborate, because you might not realize that you're thinking about the same question, or even get new insights into how you could do something differently or do something better. Something else that I would add as well in terms of a learning or something important for anyone thinking about doing research is the importance of disaggregated data, because usually in our reports or general provincial reports, they're usually at the higher level. However, a deeper dive into actual determinants of health would allow us as a whole to identify differential experiences of health, of illness, as well as health seeking patterns. So I'm talking about not just sex, but also gender, the Aboriginal self-identifier, race and ethnicity, because health is not universal and people's experiences of society and health and everything else that pertains to it are so different. So one blanket solution may not always work, given that people's experiences are different. So disaggregated data is so important in order to have that kind of insight. And I know we talked a lot about the ASIs, Aboriginal self-identification, and the challenges around data governance and the changing policies and priorities around that. I would like to urge everyone to not be discouraged by that, because it still remains a very, very important piece of information to look into and to investigate or to stratify analysis based on, given the availability of the variable, but also commitment to Aboriginal communities. So even though it's a work in progress in terms of data governance, I really urge everyone to consider it in their work and to incorporate that as they plan and do their research. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Ornella, Karin, and Andrew for presenting with us today for IH Research Week. Thank you to Jillian Frost in the background, who I can see, even though the folks online can't see her, she's in the wings, and I know that she's another team member. So thank you all for the presentation. We sincerely appreciate it. To attendees that want to continue on the conversation, please feel free to contact me, and I'd be happy to connect you to the presenters. My email is below my head, or you can email research@interiorhealth.ca. So it's a sincere honor and pleasure to introduce two Syilx Okanagan Nation knowledge keepers residing in Westbank First Nations that'll be providing us with some closing and parting words to support ending this week's event or events, I should say, in a good way. So thank you to both Elder Pamela and Elder Grouse for being with us today, and the spotlight is yours and the little ones.
Lim, and good to see everybody again. So my name is Pamela Barnes. My ancestral name is Chuchawasket, which means the coming of a storm or the coming of change. And we've got our little great-grandson with us here today. And you can introduce him, Jackson, with his ancestral name.
His ancestral name is Milkanoops Silsilkain, which is golden eagle headdress. My ancestral name is Kaninam Tamtan Kleitsen. Dali Hastis Poos Kanala Tisniakain. Agad schools to Mahid schools to Yayat Khalkhal Dali Hastkal Yayat Sweet. Why apana why I am was Dali Hasti Hit Eagle Tampula. He is Kukulal, he is 8 white skitch. Why we stimmy he is Naxil. Oil was Witsum was Tichum to speak Kask. Yayat stim. Putikuala. Police Naxil, who is little he Kaus Pecham to Slatinum to Papalacha to Yayatstim is Slechwikel Isk. Why Limna Pipis Naklil is Lachlacht. Why we stimmy is Nakailsted. Thank you, Creator, for allowing me to say some words and some prayers. All week you guys have been talking about some very good things that are good for everybody. And I commend each and every one of you for being here and doing this work. At this time, the sun is out, the sun is shining, but the other day it was raining, which is good for the land, and it's turned, the land has turned to fall time. My people have been on the land, they've gathered berries, they've dug roots, and now they're going to do some hunting for the winter. We are still here, and we still do these things that we've been doing for thousands and thousands of years. And we still do that. We still go gather. We still hunt. and we still eat our foods, and we still practice our language, and we still practice our ceremonies. So I thank each and every one of you for being here this week, and let's have a good rest of the day, and let's have a good weekend. Have some good turkey. Thank you. Lim Lim.
So I would like to, thank everybody for being here as well, and all of the work that you have done, and remind you to embrace your medicine. We have our little medicine right here, and we're very much looking forward to this weekend, and taking part in Thanksgiving, which comes from our First Nations peoples from the East, that first shared these harvest ceremonies and feasts with newcomers to these lands. And for us, this is the time of year that we have our Four Foods Feast. So it's an important time for all First Nations, and then all of us, as this celebration has now been shared throughout this continent. So good work, everybody, and go embrace your family. That's your medicine, and enjoy your turkey or whatever else it is that you put on your table. Maybe have your pie first. Lim Lim, have a good weekend.
Thank you so much, both Elder Pamela and Elder Grouse, for providing both the opening and the closing of this week. And we have sincere gratitude to you both for taking the time to be with us. You're making me smile because I'm thinking about food now. So I'm thinking about turkey and family and love and connection. And we thank you for that. I thank you for that. And for some final words from IH leadership, it is a true honor to introduce Dr. Dee Taylor, IH Corporate Director for the Research Department, among many other hats that she holds. So Dee, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Kim. I just very briefly wanted to provide some closing remarks. So as I come to you from my home in Eagle Bay, and I think about, Elder, what you were saying around the food and the family and our kinds of thinking of that as medicine. I come to you from, as I said, my home in rural Eagle Bay, which is along the Shuswap Lake in the unceded traditional territory of the Shuapnaq peoples. As we think about all of the presentations this week and we close another annual research week, I wanted to offer some thank yous and some reflections. My first thank you is to you, elders, for helping us start and end our week in a good way. Your words remind us that a land acknowledgement is about reflection, appreciation, and considering each of our roles in reconciliation. We send our gratitude to the Indigenous peoples of the land that each of us have the privilege to be on, knowing that we are here in unceded territory as a guest. So my heart really sends my gratitude out to your peoples and to your acknowledgements and our welcome and closing remarks, elders. I want to thank the entire research department team in Interior Health for their work in making this week possible, especially to Sage Renner, who's been in the background, and Kim Peak, who's been in the foreground, and their excellent work in welcoming all of the presenters and the audiences each day. Your smiling faces and skilled help were very much appreciated. Thank you to all the presenters. It takes a lot of work to pull your thoughts together for a presentation and then to provide that presentation. I was able to participate in most of the presentations, and I am truly humbled at the authenticity and quality of what each presenter had to say and share with us. Thank you to all the attendees, all of you out there in the audience, still there. I'm pleased to let you know that we had people from within IH attending, the province, and internationally. We couldn't have a research week without an audience, and you joining us and sharing information and knowledge with us is really much appreciated. Now for some final reflections. I've been working in research in interior health for 7 years as of next Tuesday. In those 7 years, there's been an exponential growth from a couple of us in the department to now over 43 people. Plus, we have several students, as you've heard from this morning, who also help us by bringing their projects and helping us learn with them. Not only have we seen growth in our interior health group, we have seen a strong provincial network of research leaders within each of the health authorities come together, support each other, and work towards our common goal of creating research infrastructure within the health system to support the advancement of good quality of care and good quality of work lives for those that work in this complex, dynamic health system. There is still much work to do. This week has offered some excellent examples of how research supports this common goal. Research is care, and care is research. And what I mean when I say that is not only in the very practical sense of delivering care in terms of how we search for ways to continually improve what we do, but also in the sense of the ethic of care, in the way walking through the research steps requires us to consider how we do what we do and orientate the why of what we do. And with that, I want to wish each of you a good Thanksgiving, and again, a reminder of the privilege of the lands of the peoples. Thank you so much. And that's it.
Thanks so much, Kat, for the as well. I'd like to invite the HDC side of things to invite everybody today. We have like our Ornella officer is to challenge portion. Like, really not have slides about the content. I think it's great to have time to Tracy to have able to provide a document and also provide these rabbits and all of those just really is really important. And like I really like to try to get a research department, mass diversity, so also diversity and showing some levels in there. And the young partners, presentation and research community chairs, we try to work calls with the yesterday that was included. And for me, I'm looking to see how I can seem like we're actually this naturally was because that's really works. And my CPH research, I know you have our
of course, thank you, Kim. That was such a opportunity for a big long week of research and democracy going on, though. Thank you for this. And there's what Kim said, it was an amazing week. I did all these meetings, especially other Anna and Ross. Thank you so much for your openings and for the day. It really warms my heart here to hear what I learned from you guys. Thanksgiving is always so humbling. So thank you, everyone, and goodbye. And I hope to see you next year.